Businesses who are able to successfully adopt Gen AI into their own operations to support their products, etc., will be at a massive competitive advantage.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. Thanks again for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please like, comment, and share in your favorite podcast app. And we'll keep sharing amazing conversations like the one we have for today. I'm your host, Dan Turchin, CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. I'm also an investor and an advisor to more than 30 AI-first companies. And as you know, a firm believer in the power of technology to make humans better. If you're passionate about changing the world with AI, or maybe just looking for your next adventure, let's talk. We learn from AI thought leaders weekly on this show. And of course, the added bonus is you get one AI fun fact. Today's fun fact, Mateo Wong writes in The Atlantic that AI doomerism is a decoy and that big tech's blustering on about how AI threatens the extinction of our species is not only hyperbole, but it's self-serving rhetoric. This was a reaction to this past week's 22-word missive authored by Sam Altman from OpenAI and others, imploring the AI community to see it as a threat as dangerous as pandemics or nuclear war. We all agree 22 words is too few when comparing AI to nuclear war. Read the statement and let me know what you think in the comments. As always, we'll link to the full article in today's show notes. But now shifting to this week's conversation, today's guest has had a front row seat for every technology platform shift for the past more than 20 years. More important, he has played an important role in enabling several of them. Kit Colbert joined tech stalwart VMware in September of 2003 and currently serves as Senior Vice President and Chief Technology Officer. He's responsible for ensuring VMware's long-term technology leadership through research and innovation programs. Kit manages the VMware engineering services team, advanced R&D initiatives, the design and UX team, and the company's ESG commitments. Kit was previously VMware's cloud CTO, general manager of VMware's cloud-native apps business, CTO for VMware's end-user computing business, and the lead architect for the vRealize operations suite. Kit's a recognized thought leader on application modernization and multi-cloud trends, and a frequent speaker. Just from his Twitter feed, I know that he's also a globetrotter. Kit holds a bachelor's of science in computer science from Brown University. And without further ado, Kit, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. Let's get started by having you share a bit more about your background and how you got into this space.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So yeah, I've been always a technologist, I think, going back to my younger days growing up, wanting to play with computers, always being fascinated with how they work and just loving to learn new things and being exposed to new technologies. And I think I've been afforded a great opportunity of that here at VMware. I've been, as you mentioned, here about 20 years now. I'm a lifer, as I call myself. It's few and far between in Silicon Valley, but I've just, I think, been fortunate to be able to work on a number of different profound technologies, starting with the core hypervisor, what we did with ESX, part of vSphere, moving on to looking at managing performance management and so forth with vRealize, getting into cloud native applications and, how application architecture is changing and what we can do to better support businesses there. And then to where I am today, which is a much broader purview across VMware, but obviously having a big focus on what we're doing and what the industry is doing from an AI, ML, and Gen AI space. So just, really excited that we're seeing a new inflection point in the industry. And I think there's going to be a ton of changes because of that.
An amazing journey. As a Silicon Valley history buff, I want to know how the culture at VMware, just truly one of the icons in Silicon Valley, has changed in the 2 decades you've been there.
A good question. So I would say there's some aspects of the culture that have actually been fairly consistent, and there's some aspects that have changed. So when I first started at VMware, actually, interestingly, I first started as an intern back in the summer of 2002. And at that point, I think there were about 150 or so folks at the company. When I started full time in September 2003, there were probably around double that, maybe about 300, maybe a little bit less. Today, there's, I don't know, 38,000, give or take. So, much, much larger. And what's interesting is that obviously, given the scale changes, there have been a lot of culture changes as part of that. How do you sort of grow and scale as an organization? But for me, what I find really interesting is the things that haven't changed. I remember when I first joined, just this culture of empowerment that, especially at a smaller company, we were still a startup at the time, I suppose. You just had to get a lot of stuff done, right? And there's kind of this empowerment to go get that stuff done. And I think that's still sort of there today. There's been a focus on innovation as well. It's like something that's so core to our identity, really, that it's something that's been there from the beginning. It's something that's still here today. And so I think it's interesting to see that there are many of these things that haven't changed. And what's interesting, even more than that, I find, are that some of the things that made us strong earlier now actually work a little bit against us as a larger organization. So, for instance, one of the things we did was fairly early on create business units, try and silo, the different parts of the engineering organization. And the purpose of doing that was because of the fact that at the time, you look at compute virtualization or storage virtualization, network virtualization, these are three very discrete markets, discrete buyers and selling patterns and so forth. But of course, where we are today, and it's been this for a few years now, where these are all kind of coalesced. With cloud, it's just infrastructure, and you get compute, storage, and network there. So some of these traditional silos that we have, and sort of the focus for each of these teams on moving quickly and optimizing for their own individual products, don't make sense when you're actually trying to sell a more holistic solution. So we've had to make a lot of shifts in mindset and culture to focus on, let's not just optimize for my one product, let's optimize for this entire solution that we're selling. And of course, there's a bunch of, different internal transformations you've got to make there. So I think it's interesting, right? It's both VMware itself is changing and evolving as it grows, but also the industry is changing and evolving. There's a lot of things that worked for us before that we've got to start questioning and figuring out, okay, how do we change that so it works for us in this new environment?
Many tech companies struggle to grow beyond a very founder-led culture. And Dan Green was an iconic founder and CEO until 2008. You predate that transition, and you've certainly been part of the phenomenal growth of the company since then. Talk us through what was appropriate or what worked for the culture at VMware that let you grow so successfully after Dan left.
Yeah. So a couple of interesting thoughts on that one. I do think, and I've heard this from other people, this notion that the founder or founders and who they are as people really set the tone for the culture of the organization. And I think that's so true. When you look at Diane and the other founders for VMware, is that it is sort of an extension of who they are as people and their sort of personality. These are folks that hard workers, very technically savvy, innovators, but also very kind as people. And I think there's this element of our value system, our ethics at VMware, which really comes to the forefront. In fact, we made it a slogan. It's called EPIC 2, EPIC, well, 2 C's, EPICC, execution, passion, integrity, customers, and community. And it's interesting that we took this thing that, when I look back, I could feel it and sort of knew it was there, but we didn't have a name for it. We didn't necessarily talk about it explicitly. And so one of the things we did was, after Diane left, we had Paul Moritz and then Pat Gelsinger. We really codified that into this term, this EPIC 2 term, which we now use oftentimes internally. It's like, okay, what's the epic thing to do here? What's the right sort of decision to make? And using that to help us guide our decision making, for instance. So that's one way I think it's kind of capturing some of those essences. Now, I think the other thing, as I was mentioning earlier, is we also need to challenge what's worked before, and does that really work, and is it serving us today? And I think honestly, in some ways, we've been probably a little bit slower to do that than we could have been otherwise. I think these are some of the most difficult things to do. You look at a company like Microsoft, right, who made the big switch from this Windows mindset to now Azure being sort of the centerpiece of their product portfolio. And I think it's a similar sort of thinking with VMware. How do we really evolve as an organization? And I think that's really what you're seeing, especially over the past, let's say, 4 or 5 years, where a lot of our business, of course, comes from the on-prem virtualization, vSphere, that is the bedrock of our company. But a lot of our future comes from this whole focus we have on multi-cloud. How are we supporting customers irrespective of where they're running applications, whether that happens to be on our infrastructure or not? And I think and it's funny, one of the other challenges we have as an organization is most people still think of us as that on-prem data center virtualization company, when in fact, we've got a very diversified product portfolio now and do all these things that I think a lot of people don't know about. So I think these have been some of the big both opportunities for us as well as challenges, in that it's been clear to us where we need to grow and evolve as an organization to help customers in a much broader range of areas. But at the same time, because of the success we had with vSphere, that sort of overshadows, and how do you sort of push through that? So I think that's been one of the big challenges that we've had to do, is really make sure we keep that top of mind and make a lot of noise about it out in the environment with customers in the market.
So to your point, you're no longer the hypervisor company. You've got this much broader vision for a multi-cloud future, and I'd love for you to share with us what that vision is, and then how do you turn the battleship?
Sure. Yeah. So it's funny. I've given this talk a couple of times around innovation, or really around disruption, and some of the interesting aspects of it. And I think what you commonly see is that an organization, when there's a disruptive force, you first try to ignore it because it's like, oh, this thing's not happening or whatever. And then you try to compete with it oftentimes. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But then the third phase is to coexist, right? And to leverage it. And if you look at these kind of broad 3 steps, I think VMware went through those exact 3 steps with cloud. When it first came out, what's interesting, if you look at when AWS first released S3 EC2, I think it was 2006, 2007, around that timeframe. That was actually the time of our sort of greatest early growth, right? We're growing, 50% plus, 75% year over year, just doing, wildly fast growth things with vSphere. And that was the time when this new cloud thing started. And of course, for us, we were just trying to keep just keep the train on the tracks as much as we could while we grew so fast. It didn't make sense to go look at this very up and coming early technology, which was completely unproven at the time. So the first few years, sort of ignore it because we had this other business to run. And then, of course, I think there's a lot of questions around, could enterprises adopt cloud? And then, where we eventually got to, and we created our own cloud, by the way, called vCloud Air, which I think had some challenges for a number of reasons. But where we eventually got to, which makes the most sense, was to actually partner with the clouds, to actually deliver our vSphere infrastructure capabilities directly into AWS. So we have a partnership with them called VMware Cloud on AWS. And it's been out for how long now? Six-ish years, I would guess. And it's doing very, very well. And so what we realized was, hey, we don't need to look at cloud as a competition necessarily. We can look at it as a partner. And these cloud players can actually be partners. And that's exactly what we're doing. So where we broadened our lens to is this notion that what we want is to be able to support customers and their applications wherever it is they happen to be running. And we support that along a number of different axes. We support it in providing infrastructure, which is compatible across all clouds, as well as on-prem. So we have partnerships, by the way, not just with AWS, but with Microsoft, with Google, with IBM, Oracle, with Alibaba. It sort of goes across the board there, where you can run vSphere-based infrastructure in all of those clouds. So obviously we want to do that for infrastructure, but we want to do broader than that. We want to be able to provide management of these things? How do you do cost management? How do you do automation and governance across all of these environments? How do you do things like security? We've got security products. How do you provide mobile device management, virtual desktops, these sort of things across clouds, networking, and then modern application development as well. So CI/CD systems and build systems and developer experience and supporting access to all these different services. So that's really where we are today, is providing a whole bunch of horizontal capabilities that are available across all clouds and on-prem. Fundamentally, where I see the industry going is very much to this multi-cloud architecture. So today, what you often find is that developers choose clouds based on the best-of-breed services that might be available there. So for instance, you want to do some sort of Gen AI type workload. You're going to say, okay, which cloud is going to offer me the best solution there? Or maybe it's a cloud service like OpenAI's ChatGPT. In any case, you make a decision, but then there's all these other aspects, like how do you secure it? How do you manage its cost? How do you manage the pipeline, the CI/CD pipeline for it? And these are areas where we think, hey, we can drive some level of standardization, help reduce that sort of chaos that a lot of companies are facing today. So I think what we're seeing overall at an industry level is a new type of architecture that will be evolving, which is that you're going to have a bunch of capabilities that you want to drive consistency in across clouds, but then you also want to be able to take advantage of the best of breed services within individual clouds. So how do you sort of balance that out? That's exactly the question that we're trying to answer at VMware. And that's really where our thinking has evolved to over the past, let's say, 10 years or so.
Your team has published a lot in the last few months on VMware's generative AI strategy and perspectives. Share with our audience, where does generative AI intersect with the multi-cloud vision that you just talked about?
Mm-hmm. Oh, in many different ways. When we think about AI as a strategy for ourselves, there's really three key pillars there. So we call them smarter businesses, which is about our customers, smarter products and services, which is about how do we infuse AI, ML, Gen AI into our products to make them better at whatever it is they do, and smarter VMware, which is how do we leverage AI, Gen AI in our internal operations to optimize and improve how we operate. So let me take each of those, and maybe I'll start with the last one first. So like every other company, we're looking at how do we optimize internal operations. So for instance, you look at our documents site. We've actually, it's not a large language model, it's just I think a regular language model. We've implemented there so you can ask natural language queries of the document system. So you don't necessarily need to do a keyword search. You can just say, hey, here's what I'm looking for. We'll find like the right things for you. So that's like one example. There's a bunch of other things that we're looking at. From a product perspective, we haven't done too much on the Gen AI space yet. There's a lot of traditional ML, sort of anomaly detection type of things that we do across the board. But there are a tremendous amount of activities around Gen AI that we're starting to look at. So for instance, GitHub Copilot is a very popular thing with developers. What would that look like for a VMware environment where you could have sort of a chat or text-based interface to our entire set of products that someone might have deployed? And that gets especially interesting as you start looking at more complicated automation tasks and these sorts of things. So we're starting to explore what that looks like. Things like managing Kubernetes using a large language model, again, as sort of a chat interface. We've got some prototypes of that running internally. So a lot of these are very exploratory right now, but we're working with customers to say, okay, what works, what doesn't work, what do they want from us? And then the final one is the first one I mentioned, the smarter businesses pillar. And that's really about how do we provide the right sorts of technologies to help our customers drive Gen AI solutions in their environments, whether that's in a data center or out in the public cloud. So let me give you just a short summary of what I'm hearing from customers about what they're looking for. And what you see is that there's a pretty wide range of use cases out there. So I'll talk to some customers who are smaller, maybe don't have huge IT or technical departments. These are folks maybe like law firms. And what they're really looking for is something a tailored cloud service to their industry vertical. So this would be, again, legal services, something, a large language model specifically trained on reading court transcripts and summarizing them, or doing whatever. Of course, we saw that bad example recently where some lawyers used ChatGPT to write some briefing for the court, which didn't go over well. But the thought is that how can you leverage this with the right sort of human oversight and input, right? Now, what they want is, they don't want all the nerd knobs, all the detailed tools. They just want a simple service. And in fact, they don't necessarily even want to be directly exposed to the large language model itself. They just want to have a nice interface for it, keep it simple. Now, I think there's a different class of folks who are going to want a general purpose large language model, something like a GPT-4 that, generally speaking, works well for a wide variety of applications and uses. They're probably going to want it delivered as a service, but they're going to be likely very concerned around privacy, data contamination, IP contamination, and these sorts of issues. And so some of the current cloud services won't work well for them because of the fact that prompts and so forth are used as training in the future, and so on and so forth, right? But they're going to want a service there. Then there's another category of folks that we've talked to that will want to do everything themselves, that they have, very high security and compliance standards. They're going to need to run all this either in their own environment or in a public cloud, but just using the basic infrastructure primitives, things like, EC2 and so forth. They're going to want a whole stack above and beyond that. So we're really focused on the latter two of these, and particularly for the third one, how can we enable folks to take advantage of their existing on-prem vSphere environments to stand up these Gen AI solutions? So there's a lot of partnerships we're working on there. VMware does not want to drive, every aspect of this, especially from a model perspective, foundation model. That's not our business. We're looking to partner there. What we're trying to do is bring all that together to make it simple as possible for customers to quickly take advantage of this, do so in a way that reduces risk and ensures privacy, and also is very cost effective.
As an AI community over the past, call it 50 years, if we want to expand the aperture a little bit, we've gone through cycles. We call them AI winters and AI summers. And nobody would argue that we're currently in an AI summer. But in historical context, as odd as it may sound, we're likely to encounter another AI winter. And typically, again, if we look historically, the reason that happens is because we create unrealistic expectations. And then there's a kind of a sense of, a deflating feeling. The air goes out of the balloon when, when consumers realize that the technology isn't maybe as intelligent as they thought. As an AI enthusiast, I definitely see an AI winter ahead, potentially because of the incredible amount of hype.
Yep.
What's your sense from talking to customers, and you interact with some of the most savvy technologists and organizations? What happens when, for example, organizations realize that Microsoft wants to charge 40% more for its Copilot features, or, not just the cost, but the performance of these models today, while we have a shortage of GPUs and, a variety of very fundamental limitations, both cost and performance are going to disappoint when it comes to these first generation Gen AI applications. What happens when the buying public starts to experience these?
That's a really good question. It's funny. I hear more often the crypto winter type of phenomenon than the AI one. And I think it's, so to answer your question, I think it's insightful to compare the two, because you may be right. We may be in a situation where there is, certainly there's a tremendous amount of hype around AI, Gen AI. Everybody and their brother, it seems like, is trying to figure out, what's my Gen AI strategy, right? What am I going to do here? And so, but it's kind of interesting to compare that with crypto. And I think with AI, there's so many obviously clear applications and use cases here. It's just sort of mind-blowing, right? Whereas with crypto, I felt like it was always a little bit of a stretch. Okay, this like Web3 thing, it's pretty cool in theory, but why do I need it exactly? So what does that mean for me? Well, what it means is that, yeah, even if some of the claims or the perceptions are a little bit overblown for AI or Gen AI, I do think there's a lot of real stuff behind that, right? And that some people might get a little bit disappointed, oh, it doesn't quite meet my ridiculously lofty expectations. But the reality, I think, when it comes down to it, is that businesses who are able to successfully adopt Gen AI into their own operations to support their products, et cetera, will be at a massive competitive advantage compared to those that don't. I think that's just, crystal clear to anyone that's paying attention, right? So what does that mean for me? Well, what it means for me is that even if there is some blowback from the potential overhyping here, some people may be affected. Some companies, may say, okay, I'm going to stop investing in this or whatever, but they'll find themselves at a disadvantage fairly quickly compared to those who have figured it out. So I think what's required here is that we got to get back to basics in many ways. And I think what you're seeing in the excitement of large language models is, in some ways, people throw out the basics of data science that went behind and go behind so much of the history of AI and ML, which is that you've got to have some quantitative way of measuring the effectiveness of any sort of AI model, whether it's a large language model or not. And so, does your company have an evaluation suite, for instance, that you're going to measure this by? And of course, OpenAI with ChatGPT used a number of different things, right? Like, it can take the bar and pass the bar and, pretty mind-blowing stuff, which may or may not be useful for your organization. Like, do you care that the system can pass the bar or not? Maybe not. Maybe, it needs, you have some other more specific things. And I think that's really what it comes down to, is getting something that's quantifiable and measurable that is geared towards your organization and what your organization's looking for. That way you can say, great, this thing's hyped, it's awesome, let's just run the tests. Let's, take all the emotion out of it, just get some numbers and see how this thing does. Moreover, given the massive proliferation of models, both, closed or proprietary, as well as the open models, this gives you a good way of comparing them. I definitely am one of the people who believe that there will be many different models out there that, in fact, singular organizations, especially large ones, will likely be using multiple models, within that organization for different use cases, and that you'll have some specialization there. I think there will be some like, GPT-4, which are amazing and, good enough for many, many different use cases. But at the same time, we might find that, hey, like from an optimization standpoint, performance standpoint, especially if you want to get to a point where you might be able to run these on CPUs instead of GPUs or other sorts of accelerators, you're going to want to possibly want a smaller, more narrower model that focuses more on the use case that you care for. So I do think some of it is coming in and saying, okay, there's a lot of hype here. There is actual value there. We just got to be thoughtful about how to take advantage of it.
So I've been talking to Kit the technologist. Now I want to talk to Kit the human being. So there's this interesting, call it the spectrum, that's developing quickly in Silicon Valley. Our fearless leaders are everywhere on the spectrum, from call it, on one end, Sundar Pichai saying this is the most significant invention since fire. And then, you can agree or disagree with my spectrum, but on the other end, call it, Elon Musk saying, it's more dangerous than nukes. Where is Kit on that spectrum in terms of how you're embracing some of these new technologies?
That's a good one. Where do I fall? So I guess where I fall is that, okay, so there's a couple different aspects to it. Is this thing a good thing or a bad thing? Because some people, they have all the doomsayers out there. I think like many other technologies, it's to some degree in the eye of the beholder and really depends on what we do with it. I think a lot of it will come down to the sort of policies that we create. I think that oftentimes many of these technologies exacerbate existing policies, whether they're good or bad. You often find that a lot of technologies exacerbate things like inequality, right? So in some ways, okay, is that bad? Yeah, but maybe there's policy things that really get behind it. So for me, this is a technology, this is a tool. And like any other, I think we do need some sort of sensible regulation of it. And we got to be thoughtful in how we do that. Unfortunately, a lot of lawmakers don't understand these technologies at all. And, we don't want to create more bad policy on top of this. We got to be really thoughtful about that. But at the same time, I guess on that second part of it, which is the degree of impact of this, I do think it'll be hugely impactful. I do think it'll change a lot. I'm not to the point yet where I think, we're going to see millions of jobs replaced with AI. I do see it more as augmenting humans today. I mean, you look at it across the board, right? You look at sort of code it produces. And the thing, like these things still hallucinate a lot. And in some ways, you as a programmer, you got to be almost more on your game to look at this code that was generated and really make sure it's doing the right thing than just writing it yourself. And so I think where I see it playing out is that it's going to be very helpful and help drive productivity, again, if used correctly. And potentially in the future, as these things get smarter and more advanced, who knows what's going to happen. But one of the things, and again, I'm not a deep data scientist, and so I'd love to talk to folks about this who are. I have conversations with a variety of folks, and one of the things that sort of became somewhat clear to me is that there's something that humans have, this notion of intuition, which I think I don't know if there's any sort of AI models that can really replicate that to some degree. And that for me is still the kind of thing that differentiates us as human beings from the machines, so to speak, is this notion of intuition. And it does seem to me that is where we will continue to add value as people in this, right? So again, I think, and of course it'll, perhaps some roles or some jobs, maybe there's not as much intuition needed. I don't know. But I think for a lot of roles, there absolutely are. And especially if you look at, going back to programming, I think a lot of it, while there is science to it, a lot of it's an art. And a lot of that is driven by your own sort of feeling and sort of gut sense, if you will, right? So in any case, I'm kind of, I guess, more in the middle where I think this is awesome. And certainly it's ridiculously impactful and just kind of mind-blowing when you look at it, and will have profound changes on the industry. At the same time, I'm not necessarily a doomsayer. I don't think this is going to end humanity. I do think it means that, particularly where governance comes in, I mean that both sort of, US government and federal government type things, as well as smaller sort of policy decisions made at an individual company level, that becomes more and more important. And to some degree, its importance gets magnified.
So VMware customers around the world are looking to you and your team to drive an AI strategy that we'll call, is responsible. What does it mean to you and your team, and maybe any examples of culturally how you emphasize the need to practice responsible AI?
Yeah, so it's actually something that we've been working on internally. What does it mean exactly, to your question, to have responsible, ethical use of AI? So we put together an internal document focusing around that, and so there's a number of things that go into it, right? There's a notion of accountability. There's a notion of transparency. How to there's that whole aspect of AI explainability, for instance. That, you need to be able to understand what the system's doing. Another really key aspect is, how do we ensure, as I mentioned before, that AI does not exacerbate existing inequalities? And as we all know, that there are a lot of those inequalities out there, and they are latent in the data that we often use to train these models. So we've got to be very, very thoughtful around that. And so we're actually doing that, right? We're focused on the data that we're using. And oftentimes this is really basic stuff. It's like trying to understand, virtual machine performance and looking for anomalous behavior there, or, cloud costs and looking for anomalous behavior. So it doesn't necessarily have that same sort of potential societal impact that, may happen from screening job candidates, or for certain traits or other sorts of things, right? Which there's all sorts of bias inherently. But I think that's also part of it, that we also have internal guidelines that state you cannot make decisions based on people using AI trained models today. We just don't allow it because we're not confident enough that we can remove enough bias from that system. So in some ways, maybe we're starting off a little bit more conservative, but I think it's also that mindset where we want to be sure that when we do these things, we are extraordinarily confident that we're not creating more problems, driving more inequities than already exist, for instance. So that's just one example of the types of things that we're doing. So, we do have, lack of a better term, an AI council internally that provides some sort of oversight and guidance on this. And the goal is really to educate. I think most folks internally are well-meaning, well-intentioned. And oftentimes where you see problems is because they happen in people's blind spots. They're just not thinking about this stuff. They don't realize that the data they have might be biased in some way, or that they're applying this in a way that may not be as fair as it could be. So this is really where we're focused, and just trying to educate and make sure that as all the engineers and people, not just engineers, people across the company are wanting to move fast, play with the new tech, do the cool new stuff, that we also do so in a thoughtful, responsible manner.
Okay, we're about out of time, but you're not getting off the hot seat without answering one last question for me. So I want to know, what's your advice to the kid who joined VMware in 2003?
Oh man, well, lots of things. So I know I've got so many stories that would take, a long time to tell. So maybe I'll try to keep it short. I think a couple of things, just very briefly, I've had some times in my career that have gone very well. I've also had some times in my career that things haven't gone very well, and that I would say that I've failed at. And what's interesting when I look back is that the times I was learning the most were oftentimes those times where I eventually failed at whatever it was I was doing. It was kind of a daily struggle. It was not easy, right? I wouldn't will it on someone, but at the same time, I think it's this, maybe it's the Silicon Valley mindset, this notion of, failure is not necessarily a bad thing. And in my mind, it's not about whether you fail or not. It's about whether you learn from your mistakes, from your failures. And I think I'm fortunate in that I've been able to capitalize on those failures by learning from them and being ready for the next challenge. As a matter of fact, I think, I've been in the CTO role, the corporate CTO role, for about 2 years now. And I think a lot of my ability to be successful here was because I got in over my head previous times, failed, but learned a lot from it. So I think my advice would be, don't be stupid about it, like jumping into the deep end when you can't swim at all, but lean in a little bit, even if it makes you a little bit uncomfortable, because even if you're not fully successful, you'll learn a lot from it. And also, I think the other aspect of it is that you'll also find, which I've learned the hard way, how to surround yourself with folks who can support you as well. So that's probably the biggest learning, and I think the thing that's helped me most to grow in my career.
It's been great hanging out. Thanks for stopping by.
Thanks so much, Dan. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Where can the audience learn more about you and the work that your team's doing?
So VMware.com for general things, and then octo.vmware.com. You can find me and a bunch of the other technologists here at VMware.
Brilliant. Well, we're all rooting for you to succeed. Congrats on all the success.
Thank you so much.
Well, there you have it. That's it for this week on AI and the future of work. As always, I'm your host, Dan Turchin from PeopleRain. And of course, we're back next week with another fascinating guest.